In 1917, Russia's failures in World War I and internal issues led to the fall of the monarchy. Attempts to establish a democratic government ended in failure. In October, the Bolsheviks, a small but well-organized revolutionary party, came to power. The new regime faced fierce resistance. A civil war began. The opponents of the Bolsheviks included officers of the Tsarist army, a significant part of the Cossacks, Germans, the Entente forces, and the Czechoslovak Legion. Under Lenin's leadership, the Bolsheviks managed to hold the center of Russia. Trotsky introduced strict discipline in the Red Army. It achieved its first victories. By the end of 1918, the Reds had taken Samara, Simbirsk, and Kazan. The Germans were defeated and withdrew from Ukraine. In 1919, the Bolsheviks' plundering of the war-weary and starving people led the Whites, with Entente support, to approach the heart of Red Russia. However, the Bolsheviks eventually achieved strategically important victories. Russia, Forgotten Years, Civil War, Part 2. In January 1910, the Red Army captured Riga and Vilnius in the northwest, Kharkov and Baranovichi in the south. The new governments of Lithuania and Belarus declared the creation of Soviet republics. In February, the residents of Kiev welcomed the Red Army into the city, hoping the Bolsheviks would restore political stability. Antonov Ovsenko commanded the Ukrainian front, and Christian Rakovsky led the Soviet government in Ukraine. However, in the spring, the Whites were more successful. Denikin advanced from the south, and Kolchak's offensive in the Urals became threatening. Admiral Alexander Kolchak was declared the supreme ruler of Russia at the end of 1918. Kolchak gained popularity during the World War, first with successful actions in the Baltic, then as commander of the Black Sea Fleet. After the February Revolution, he arrived in Petrograd and was sent by the provisional government to the USA and Great Britain. After the October coup, Kolchak returned to Russia and became the military minister of the Omsk government. At that time, two anti-Bolshevik governments claimed power in Siberia. Komuk, the committee of members of the Constituent Assembly, was formed with Czech support in June 1918 in Samara and later moved to Omsk. In Tomsk, a provisional Siberian government was formed. Its head, Pyotr Vologodsky, a supporter of establishing a dictatorship in Russia, formed another government, the Ufa Directory, which, with Entente support, decided to transfer full power to Kolchak. He was proclaimed the supreme ruler and commander-in-chief of the Russian army. However, Kolchak's power was limited by obligations to the Entente. His decisions were controlled by General Janin, commander of the Entente forces in Siberia, and British General Knox, who oversaw aid to the White Movement. Kolchak controlled only half of the armed formations in Siberia, but his army of 112,000 bayonets was a formidable fighting force. On March 6, 1919, Kolchak intensified the offensive. Within a week, his troops occupied Ufa, and by the end of April, they had conquered vast areas with a population of 5 million people. The Reds and Whites fiercely fought for the territory of the Russian Empire, which spanned 1/6 of the land. Most of this territory, as can be easily seen by traveling by train from Moscow to Vladivostok, is still beautiful but practically uninhabited expanses of Siberia. The Asian part of Russia from the Urals to the Far East is also known for its harsh climate. Lenin called for all forces to be thrown against Kolchak. 15,000 communists were sent to the Eastern Front by party call. Sergei Kamenev was appointed commander of the front. The troops of Commander 𝒉𝒂, operating on the southern section of the front, dealt a significant blow to Kolchak's battle formations in April. By mid-May 1919, the White defense was cracking. In June, Ufa fell. At this moment, Commander-in-Chief 𝒖𝒔𝒊𝒂 ordered part of the forces to be transferred south against Denikin. Kamenev refused to comply and was recalled to Moscow. But there he managed to convince Lenin of his correctness. As a result, the transfer of forces was stopped. Kamenev replaced 𝒉𝒂 as commander-in-chief. All this cost the Soviets dearly. The 25th Division of Vasily Chapayev successfully fought against the Kolchak forces in the Urals. During one of the White attacks, Chapayev was wounded and died trying to swim across the Ural River. His image became one of the legends of the Civil War. In the summer of 1919, the Reds captured, besides Ufa, major cities like Perm and Yekaterinburg, and defeated the Kolchak forces near Zlatoust and Chelyabinsk. By mid-October, they were 500 kilometers from Omsk. In November, the Kolchak Council of Ministers, led by Pepelyaev, moved from Omsk to Irkutsk. Kolchak left Omsk on an armored train on November 12th, 2 days before the Reds entered the city. It took the admiral 2 months to reach Irkutsk. On January 4th, 1920, he transferred his powers to General Denikin. But in the Baikal region, Ataman Semyonov had long been in charge. Together with his henchmen, the sadist and psychopath Baron Ungern, and other atamans, he introduced a regime of terror in Transbaikalia called Atamanshchina. The Atamans were supported by Japan, which sought control over the Far East and maintained significant forces in Russia, up to 80,000 men. Like the Atamans, the Japanese were known for their cruelty. Punitive detachments shot all suspected of sympathizing with the Soviets. These atrocities, which terrified the local population, evoked mass sympathy for the Reds. By spring 1920, when European and American troops left Siberia, only the Japanese maintained a military presence here. A wave of guerrilla warfare rose against them, the Atamans and the remnants of the White Army. The guerrilla movement has always been an important factor in Russian military strategy. The Civil War was no exception. Although initially the guerrilla units were scattered and poorly armed, they later formed large units with a total strength of several 100,000 people. Their excellent knowledge of local conditions gave them an undeniable advantage over the enemy and allowed them to inflict significant damage. Guerrillas operated throughout the country, except for the center. In Siberia, by the end of 1919, guerrilla units surrounded Irkutsk, to which Kolchak's armored train was approaching. The former authority of the supreme ruler had faded by then. The Allies turned away from him. Czech General Radila Gajda, former commander of Kolchak's Siberian army, rebelled against him in Vladivostok in November. In Irkutsk, a group of Mensheviks and social revolutionaries created their government. a polycenter. On January 15th, near Irkutsk, Czech troops, with the knowledge of General Janin, arrested Kolchak and his entourage and handed them over to local authorities. But literally a few days later, power passed to the Bolsheviks and Kolchak became a prisoner of the Irkutsk Cheka. The protocols of his interrogations would fill 19 volumes. On February 7th, the 47-year-old admiral was shot, and his body was thrown into the Angara River. Now, east of the Urals, nothing could realistically threaten the Soviet regime. In the north, the offensive against the Reds also failed. Anti-war sentiment in the Entente troops and harsh weather conditions forced the Allied command to begin evacuation. The Americans left Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, and by February 1920 there were no foreign soldiers left in northern Russia. Now all hopes of the Whites were pinned on Anton Denikin's troops in the south. Denikin became the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of southern Russia at the beginning of 1919. In honor of this event, a solemn prayer service was held in the capital of the White movement, Yekaterinodar. Denikin's political program included many progressive laws that could not yet be implemented. Now he hoped to gather all anti-Bolshevik forces under his banner and deliver a decisive blow. Taking advantage of the Reds' miscalculation, the delay in transferring troops south, Denikin began an offensive from the North Caucasus in the spring of 1919. By mid-June, Crimea was occupied. June 23rd, General Kutupov's units entered Belgorod. 2 days later, the 1st Volunteer Army of 𝑚𝒉𝒆 took Kharkov. General Wrangel's Caucasian Volunteer Army stormed Tsaritsyn. It was only captured on June 30th, thanks to the support of British tanks and armored cars, although General Shkurov's Cavalry Corps had long before managed to break through the Reds' front. On July 3rd, in Tsaritsyn, Denikin issued the Moscow Directive, an order to advance on the capital. On August 30th, he took Kiev, driving out Polish units and Petlura's army. Denikin hoped to keep Great Russia united and indivisible. Disagreements in the anti-Bolshevik camp would become one of the reasons for the defeat of the White forces. Moreover, poorly trained local volunteers reduced the combat effectiveness of Denikin's army. However, he still believed in its invincibility. Following the Moscow Directive, the Whites broke through the enemy's defense by early autumn. In August, 8,000 Don Cossacks under General Mamontov broke into the Tambov province and, after ravaging it, moved to Voronezh, where they joined Shkurov's Kuban Corps. In September, Denikin got closer to Moscow than any other White general. His troops took Orel and stopped 200 kilometers from Tula, with its arms factories, and 400 from Moscow. Victory seemed near. However, as the Whites advanced north, their problems in the rear intensified. In Ukraine, Nestor Makhno's anarchist army grew stronger. He hated Denikin, knowing that a White victory would end his dreams of a free Ukrainian peasantry. Rejecting any authority and order, Makhno and his men fought with equal fury against the Germans, Denikin's Petlura, and the Bolsheviks. Sometimes, however, Makhno formed alliances with them, but just as easily broke them. Bold, vain, and pathologically cruel, Father Makhno had about 30,000 fighters. In the fall of 1919, after Makhno's raids on the White Rear, Denikin had to withdraw an army corps from the Moscow direction to fight the anarchists. Denikin's forces began losing support in other occupied territories. The local population, often eagerly awaiting the whites, quickly lost their illusions. Corruption, extortion, and theft thrived in the White Army. Cruelty was the norm. Denikin's forces organized Jewish pogroms, which were also widely practiced by Kolchak, Yudenich, Makhno's men, and the Atamans. The whites believed that anti-Semitism was a means of uniting the Russian nation. Pogroms in Ukraine reached a scale possible only with the use of regular troops. Petlura, Makhno, and discontented peasants certainly complicated Denikin's situation, but only a well-organized army could defeat him. Lenin called everyone to fight Denikin. The Bolsheviks' tactics, based on a combination of broad propaganda and coercion, once again brought success. From September 1st to November 15th, they managed to mobilize and send over 100,000 fighters to the southern and southwestern fronts. The partially restored defense industry was already supplying the Red Army with weapons quite well. On November 20th, the Reds went on the offensive. Denikin's outnumbered forces held Wrangel for 6 days but were eventually forced to surrender the city. During the offensive, elite cavalry units were formed in the Red Army for the first time. Recent raids by Mamontov proved the high effectiveness of cavalry, and at the end of 1919, Trotsky ordered the creation of the 1st Cavalry Army. It was led by Semyon Budyonny and Klim Voroshilov. The Red Cavalry was no worse than Mamontov's. On October 24th, the 1st Cavalry defeated the White Cossacks near Voronezh, and a month later crossed the Don, driving a wedge between Denikin's army center and his right flank. After his best units were pushed back 700 kilometers, Denikin had to withdraw his main forces. In December, the Red Army recaptured Kharkov, Kiev, Odessa, and shortly after, Yekaterinoslav. In early January 1920, the 1st Cavalry and the 8th Red Army entered Rostov-on-Don. Only in February did the Whites manage to secure the Kuban. Denikin himself left for Crimea. Under pressure from senior officers, he appointed Baron Wrangel as his successor and emigrated to France on April 4th. In the north, the Red Army defended Petrograd. Nikolai Yudenich's forces had already tried several times to break into the city. Former infantry general Yudenich began forming his army in 1918 in Finland and Estonia with German support. Then Kolchak appointed him commander-in-chief of the Northwestern Forces. By the fall of 1919, Yudenich had about 18,000 bayonets on the Narva front, reinforced with British equipment. At the end of September, his advancing troops won a series of victories, but early winter and poor discipline in the army prevented further success. Trotsky skillfully raised the fighting spirit of Petrograd's defenders. He declared that Petrograd, the cradle of the revolution, would be held at any cost. Baltic sailors and workers were sent to the front lines. fresh reinforcements allowed the Red Army to push Yudenich away from all strategically important objects around Petrograd within a month. The Whites retreated to Estonia. Lenin declared Bolshevik Russia a military camp. All reserves were thrown to the front. In 1919, the Bolsheviks managed to turn the tide of the Civil War. Although after several strategic mistakes, they had to fight on 3 fronts at once. They held on and maintained their power, which they called peoples. Mass mobilizations, iron discipline, effective propaganda, Chekist terror, and Lenin's remarkable ability to make concessions at the right moment gave the Bolsheviks the necessary advantages. At the end of 1919, when the situation on the fronts stabilized, the Bolsheviks began to restore the country's economy. The party announced mobilization. The Cheka began identifying dissenters. In 1920, the Bolsheviks had to fight in the west and south of Russia. The last commander of the White movement was Pyotr Wrangel. On the remnants of Denikin's armies, Wrangel created combat units totaling 35,000 people. The British advised him to secure Crimea, but Wrangel began preparing for an offensive. Although he had the best white officers at his disposal, Wrangel understood that defeating 5 million Red Army soldiers was simply impossible. Therefore, he sought to negotiate a truce on the most favorable terms and to remove Crimea and southern Ukraine from Bolshevik influence. In June, Wrangel launched a successful offensive in the Kuban and Ukraine. He managed to catch the Bolsheviks off guard. Most of their forces were then concentrated on the Polish front. In the spring of 1920, the Polish army numbered 738,000 people. 150,000 soldiers were ready to move on Russia to protect Poland's independence, which they believed was threatened by Bolshevik imperial policy. Initially, Polish forces greatly outnumbered the Red Army. The Entente supplied Poland with weapons. French instructors worked in the troops. The Poles and Petlura, with the remnants of their forces, agreed to cooperate. On April 25, 1920, they began an offensive in northwestern Ukraine from the Pripyat to the Dnieper. The army was led by Marshal Józef Piłsudski, a revolutionary and head of the first Polish government. Piłsudski's goal was to create a federation of Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus. In this case, Ukraine would gain independence, but first, it had to be taken from the Reds. On April 26th, Polish troops stormed Zhytomyr. 11 days later, they entered Kiev. At that moment, after a series of loud victories, the Red Army Command allowed many units, including the 1st Cavalry, to rest a bit in the rear. But after the threat of the Poles' capture in Ukraine arose, the 1st Cavalry Army was urgently sent there. The main struggle unfolded on 2 fronts. The southwestern front was commanded by Alexander Yegorov, and the western by Mikhail Tukhachevsky. Before the revolution, Tukhachevsky served in the Tsar's Guard. During World War I, he was captured by the Germans but managed to escape. In 1918, he sided with the Bolsheviks and fought against Kolchak and Denikin. The Bolsheviks decided to deliver the main blow on the Western Front. Troops were sent to the Smolensk area. They were seen off with slogans written in Polish, stating that the fight was not against the people of Poland, but against its exploiters. But the first success of the Red Army was achieved not on the Western, but on the Southwestern Front. On June 5th, the 1st Cavalry Army broke through the Polish defense. On June 7th, Zhytomyr and Berdichev were recaptured. 5,000 Red Army prisoners were freed. Fresh infantry units developed the cavalrymen's success. The 3rd Polish Army was surrounded in Kiev. It managed to break out and leave on June 12th only due to mistakes by the Red Command. The Kiev operation became a turning point in the Soviet-Polish War. Piłsudski began transferring forces from the Western to the Southwestern Front. By doing so, unknowingly, he helped the advancing Red Army. Tukhachevsky formed a new mobile unit, the 3rd Cavalry Corps, and on July 4th launched a large-scale offensive in Belarus. Within a week, cavalrymen under Guy's command took Minsk and restored Soviet power there. By the end of July, the front's troops reached the Polish border. They advanced towards Warsaw. According to Tukhachevsky's pre-approved plan, all armies of the two fronts were to advance on Warsaw. However, under Stalin's pressure, the command of the Southwestern Front and the Cavalry Army disrupted this plan, and the Warsaw operation ended with a victory for Piłsudski's army. The losses were significant. Some Red Army soldiers crossed the border with Germany and were interned. But the Poles were also exhausted. During the Soviet counteroffensive in Borisov near Minsk, peace negotiations began. As early as December 8, 1919, when the Treaty of Versailles was concluded, the Entente wanted to move Poland's eastern border 200 kilometers into Russian territory. So the Soviets were prepared for this trouble before the war with Poland began. On October 12, 1920, preliminary terms of the treaty were signed. Hostilities ceased on October 18th. And although the peace treaty would be signed in Riga only on March 18, 1921, the achieved truce allowed the Bolsheviks to begin the last major operation of the civil war against Wrangel at the end of 1920. Due to political disagreements with Piłsudski, Wrangel refused to follow the orders of the Polish Supreme Joint Command. Now Wrangel's troops had to fight the Bolsheviks without allies. On September 27, Mikhail Frunze, the new commander of the Southern Front, arrived in Kharkov. Considering the Red Army's superiority in manpower and equipment, Frunze aimed not so much to capture territory as to destroy the enemy. He created a 2nd Cavalry Army and put Philip Mironov in charge. This Cossack, a World War I veteran, managed to turn poorly organized Bolshevik detachments into a strike force that played a decisive role in defeating Wrangel. However, a year after the victory over the Whites, Mironov would be arrested and killed in Butyrka prison without trial. Meanwhile, after a powerful blow from the Red Cavalry, the Whites retreated. Crimea was turned into a fortress. The Turkish wall on the Perekop Isthmus, separating the peninsula from the mainland, was considered impregnable. On the night of November 8th, Frunze began the assault on Crimea. Since frontal attacks on the Turkish wall, defended by General Kutepov, were unsuccessful, the 2nd Cavalry, despite the frost, crossed the shallow Lake Savash and struck the rear of the Perekop fortifications. Simultaneously, the Red Infantry crossed the Chongar Strait and occupied Jankoy and Karanjane. Wrangel's forces rolled south. On November 13th, Mironov's units entered Simferopol. Wrangel issued an order to retreat from Crimea. The hasty evacuation of troops and civilians was poorly organized, but most were successfully withdrawn. On November 16, 1920, a ship with the last of the 145,000 evacuees set course for Constantinople. Together with Commander General Wrangel, they left their homeland forever. Before starting the fight against Wrangel, the front conquered in Turkestan. Russian Turkestan was a vast territory in Central Asia east of the Caspian Sea. In the Soviet government, created in the capital of Turkestan, Tashkent, in 1917, the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries outnumbered the Bolsheviks. Many regions of Turkestan, such as the Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva, maintained complete independence from the Soviets. In Tashkent, the population was extremely hostile to the new authorities. The government nearly perished during the January uprising of 1919. But the Red victories over Kolchak and Denikin strengthened the Soviets' position in Turkestan, and gradually the Bolsheviks took leading roles in the government. To support local authorities, Red Army units were sent to this region. By 1920, Moscow and Tashkent were ready to absorb Bukhara and Khiva. Despite its 10-meter walls, Bukhara was vulnerable to heavy artillery. On September 20th, 1920, Frunze's units defeated the Emirates' forces and occupied the city. Emir Said Alim Khan fled to Afghanistan. The People's Republics of Bukhara and soon Khiva were proclaimed. Their leaders declared they stood not for submission to Russia, but for national independence. The civil war was nearing its end in the Caucasus. At the end of April 1920, the 11th Army of the Caucasian Front, supported by armored trains, began the Baku operation and soon took the capital of Azerbaijan. It was not difficult for 30,000 Red Army soldiers to defeat the 2,000-strong Baku garrison, weakened by mass desertion and an uprising in the city. The military operation was led by Mikhail Lewandowski, and the political transformation of the Transcaucasus by Sergei Kirov, Grigory Ordzhonikidze, and other prominent Bolsheviks. The Red Banner was presented to the victors by Nariman Narimanov, just appointed chairman of the Council of People's Commissars of the Azerbaijan Soviet Republic. On April 28th, after the creation of a temporary revolutionary committee in Baku, Narimanov appealed for help to the Soviet government. It was immediately provided. By May 1st, Soviet power was established in Baku and within the following month throughout Azerbaijan. The Red Army continued its advance to the capital of Armenia, Yerevan, where many awaited the Bolsheviks. Armenia lost two-thirds of its territory during a harsh two-front war against Turkey and Azerbaijan. The new Soviet government almost immediately ended both conflicts. However, soon the population of Yerevan, disappointed with Bolshevik policies, would rise in rebellion, but it would be brutally suppressed. The last stronghold of resistance to Bolshevism in the Transcaucasus was Georgia, whose government was led by the Menshevik Noé Zordania. On February 25, 1921, the 11th Army entered the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, where a Bolshevik uprising had been raised the day before. This uprising became the last episode of violent Bolshevization, a policy now opposed by Lenin himself. In correspondence with 𝒂𝒔𝒊𝒂, he discussed possible concessions and a coalition with local authorities. However, the coalition did not materialize. By the end of March, resistance to the Bolsheviks was suppressed throughout Georgia. Zordania and his government fled to Paris. Such large-scale operations as the Georgian one would no longer be necessary for the Bolsheviks. However, smaller clashes continued for quite some time. In Ukraine, at the beginning of 1921, Nestor Makhno, who violated the truce with the Red Army, was defeated. Fleeing from the Red Cavalry, Makhno, with the remnants of his army, fled across the Dniester to Romania. Then he settled in Paris. Petliura also fled, but small parts of his army, known for their brutality, continued to fight in Ukraine until 1922. Local clashes still brought immense suffering to ordinary people, but they no longer had strategic significance. Having defeated the main forces of the Whites, the Bolsheviks could celebrate victory. During the Civil War, the Bolsheviks developed a bureaucracy whose powers were frightening. The Soviet administrative system was the heir to the Tsarist bureaucratic apparatus with its bribery and corruption, but unchecked, it made the Red bureaucracy even more dangerous. Officials from the Communist Party adorned the same offices, with new Bolshevik icons where their Tsarist-era colleagues had recently sat. Party apparatchiks quickly built a power system based on deception and contempt for the individual. A relatively small group of people would soon manage to take control of the entire Communist Party, which by 1921 included 732,000 people. Relationships within the party leadership were mainly determined by the struggle for power. However, while the war was ongoing, Joseph Stalin, Kliment Voroshilov, Sergei Kirov, Mikhail Kalinin, Felix Dzerzhinsky, Grigory Orjonikidze, Mikhail Frunze, Lev Trotsky, Vladimir Lenin, and other Bolsheviks maintained an appearance of unity and cohesion. In March 1921, they all gathered at the 10th Party Congress. It was held under the banner of party unity and the slogan of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which in reality meant the dictatorship of the Communist Party over the proletariat. To govern the state, the Bolsheviks indeed needed cohesion. Shortly before the Congress opened, another uprising occurred in Russia, this time near Petrograd. The garrison of the fortress island of Kronstadt rose against the Bolsheviks. Red Army units under Tukhachevsky's command were sent against the rebels. Mobilization of the Bolsheviks began. By March 12th, about 300 Congress delegates were sent to unreliable military units to boost morale. Many soldiers involved in suppressing the uprising sympathized with the Kronstadt sailors, who demanded freedom of speech, free trade, private land ownership, amnesty, and political prisoners. However, the most unpleasant demand for the communists was the rebels' call to expel the Bolsheviks from the Soviets and their slogan, "All power to the Soviets, not the parties." The uprising was an open expression of dissatisfaction with the authorities, a desperate act provoked by Bolshevik repressive policies. After 2 weeks of fighting, the resistance of the Kronstadt defenders was broken. Their warships, Sevastopol and Petropavlovsk, were seriously damaged. Since Tukhachevsky recommended extensive use of artillery in street battles, Kronstadt suffered significantly. There were few casualties compared to previous battles. The rebels lost about 1,000 killed, the Bolsheviks half as many. A day after the fortress fell, several thousand of its defenders were executed. Those who managed to surrender were interrogated by the Cheka. The interrogation protocols were never published. The total number of executed and imprisoned remains unknown. Red soldiers distinguished in battles were rewarded by participating in a parade on Red Square. They were greeted by Trotsky and Tukhachevsky. 2 months later, Tukhachevsky took command of the troops suppressing the Antonov uprising in the Tambov province. The Tambov and Kronstadt uprisings forced Lenin to undertake radical economic reforms. The harsh military communism was replaced by the NEP, a new economic policy that allowed private trade and private ownership. However, the NEP lasted only a few years. At the end of 1920, fighting was still ongoing in the Russian Far East. Between 1918 and 1922, power there frequently changed hands. Since the local population had long held the Japanese in contempt, the anti-Bolshevik provisional government created with their support had no base. It was replaced by the government of the buffer state of the Far Eastern Republic, supported by Moscow. Then the Japanese helped the Merkelov brothers create another puppet government in Vladivostok, but it also did not last long. In February 1922, the Army of the Far Eastern Republic, led by Vasily Blucher, launched an offensive. On October 22nd, troops led by 26-year-old Yerenym Uborovich entered Vladivostok, ending a 20-day coastal operation. This marked the end of the Japanese intervention in the Far East. This was the most remote region where the army established Soviet power. The battle on the Pacific coast can be seen as the Civil War's finale, though the Basmachi in Turkestan held out for a few more years. Only after the main battles ended did the scale of destruction and losses become clear. Some estimates suggest over 10 million people died during the Civil War. After the war, a severe economic crisis began. Catastrophically low harvests led to famine. Crime rates soared. Including among miners, epidemics raged. Public protests became increasingly rare, while the prestige of the military rose significantly. The end of the war delighted all Russian citizens, but Bolshevik supporters celebrated especially. Having won the Civil War, these people looked to the future with confidence in their own strength and hope for a new world their leaders promised to build. The Bolsheviks believed that after their military victories, they could overcome any difficulties. They were inspired by the most progressive communist idea, led by the party under Lenin himself. Lenin played a decisive role in the Bolsheviks winning the war. He managed to combine his vision of the future and faith in the revolutionary program with an amazing ability to conduct subtle tactical battles with political and military opponents. The 4-year Civil War changed Russia forever. People were physically and spiritually scarred. Cultural and intellectual life became impoverished. However, the unorganized Bolshevik detachments of 1917 had transformed by 1992 into a strong army, becoming an important factor in international politics for many decades. The Soviet armed forces would play a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany in World War II. Although the Red Army and most of its commanders, who became the architects of the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War, did not live to see World War II, not Pavel Dybenko, one of the organizers of the 𝒂𝒂, RKK, nor Joachim Votsedis, who commanded the Eastern Front and, together with Mikhail Tukhachevsky, defeated the Czechs near Kazan, later becoming the commander-in-chief. Nor Vasily Blyucher, who fought against Ataman Dutov in 1918 and later stormed Crimea and Volokayevka. Nor Alexander Yegorov, who crushed Denikin and the Poles. Nor Ieronium Uborovich, who ended the Civil War in the Far East by defeating the Japanese. All of them, like thousands of other military leaders, would perish in the late 1930s during Stalin's purges. On December 30th, 1922, delegates of the 10th All-Russian Congress of Soviets signed the treaty establishing the USSR, fulfilling Lenin's dream of a new multinational Bolshevik state. Created from the remnants of the Russian Empire as a result of the Bolshevik coup and Civil War, the Soviet Union became one of the main international powers of the 20th century.